If you want to understand what is actually happening at the 2026 World Cup, not the goals, not the group stage tables, but the thing underneath it all, the thing that will be studied and cited long after the last whistle has blown, you do not need to look at the pitch. You need to look at two press conferences that happened on the same day, in two different countries, only hours apart, saying two completely opposite things about the same person, the same situation, and the same test of the values this sport claims to hold. And once you see them side by side, the crisis at the center of this tournament becomes impossible to ignore. This channel has been tracking every institutional decision, every statement, every walkout, and every legal filing around this World Cup since the bidding process closed. And what we are about to walk you through is not speculation. It is the documented, on the record, minute-by-minute paper trail of the moment European football stopped waiting for FIFA to act like FIFA and started acting on its own. If you follow this sport not only for the highlights, but for the story of how football actually works at its top, this one is for you. Stay with us for the next few minutes, because the pattern only makes sense when you see all the pieces together. And there is one detail from the FIFA president's own words, later in this video, that most outlets are quietly leaving out of their coverage. So here is the central question, the one everyone is dancing around but nobody is asking directly. Is FIFA still the moral center of world football? Or has that title, quietly, without a vote, without a summit, without a formal press release, already slipped somewhere else? Because on the morning of the 12th of June, 2026, one day after the World Cup opened in the United States, something happened that made the answer visible for the first time. Two governing bodies, two presidents, two statements about the exact same man, and they could not have been further apart. On one side, the president of European football released a statement so specific, so deliberately worded, so publicly aimed at correcting a wrong, that veteran football writers described it as the most significant single line UEFA has issued in decade. On the other side, the president of FIFA, asked directly about the situation, told the people asking him to chill and relax. Chill and relax. Those were the words. Those were the exact 3 words chosen by the head of the organization that runs the World Cup. Not a formal statement. Not a carefully drafted institutional response. Not even a pause to consider what the moment required. Chill and relax. And that answer, 3 words for syllables, delivered on camera at the biggest tournament on the planet, has now become the sentence that defines the fracture at the heart of world football in the summer of 2026. Because once you understand what happened to the man he was being asked about, you understand why those 3 words landed the way they did. And you understand why what came next from Salzburg, from Cairo, and from a stadium in Mogadishu has already changed the conversation entirely. This is not a story about immigration. It is not a story about a single passport, a single visa, or a single border agent having a bad afternoon. It is a story about what happens when the values a governing body prints in its brochures collide with the operational reality of the country it chose to host its most important tournament. And what happens when the president of that governing body is asked to explain the collision. It is a story about a 34-year-old man from Somalia named Omar Artan, who spent the last decade of his career earning a spot on the biggest stage his profession has to offer. It is a story about 11 hours in a windowless corridor at Miami International Airport. It is a story about a flight home he never expected to take. It is a story about a stadium in Mogadishu that filled with thousands of people, not for a match, not for a player, but for a referee coming back without the tournament he had trained his entire adult life to work at. And it is a story about a phone call from Salzburg, Austria, that changed everything. Every single piece of what you are about to hear is verifiable. Every quote, every timeline, every appointment, every walkout, every legal filing. This is not opinion. This is the record. And the record, as it stands today, is now impossible to reconcile with the version of world football FIFA promoted in the months leading up to this tournament. So let us start where the story actually starts. Not with a statement in Miami. Not with a decision in Salzburg. But with the moment a plane touched down and everything began to fall apart. Omar Artan arrived at Miami International Airport on the 6th of June, 2026. 4 days before the World Cup was scheduled to open. 5 days before he was supposed to walk onto a training pitch in Florida with the rest of the officiating delegation for their final pre-tournament briefing. He was 34 years old. Born in Mogadishu. On the FIFA International refereeing list since 2018. In the 8 years since, he had built the kind of resume that puts a man on the shortlist for a World Cup. He officiated the second leg of the CAF Champions League final in the 2025-2026 season, the highest domestic continental honor African club football has to offer. He was named CAF Men's Referee of the Year for 2025, chosen by the entire Confederation of African Football over every other qualified official on the continent. And when the FIFA officiating committee sat down to select the 52 referees who would be trusted with matches at the 2026 World Cup out of a global pool of thousands, his name was on the list. The first Somali referee in the history of the sport to be selected for the tournament. A landmark for his country. A landmark for the continent. The single most significant appointment of his professional career. He was carrying a diplomatic passport. He was carrying his official FIFA accreditation, printed, laminated, and signed. He was carrying a valid United States visa, issued in advance, cleared through the standard channels the tournament host country had set up specifically for accredited World Cup personnel. He had the right papers. He had the right documentation. He had, by any reasonable reading of what a governing body expects of its officials arriving at the country hosting its tournament, everything he needed. And then, at the immigration counter, a border agent pulled him aside. What happened next did not last minutes. It did not last an hour. It lasted 11 hours. 11 hours in secondary inspection. 11 hours of questioning. And according to Artan's own account, given after he landed back in Turkey, the questioning was not primarily focused on his football career. It was not primarily focused on his credentials, his visa, his FIFA documentation, or his intended activities in the United States over the next 5 weeks. It was focused, again according to his own testimony, heavily on Al-Shabaab, the militant organization that has operated in parts of Somalia for over a decade. An organization Omar Artan has no connection to, has never been accused of any connection to, and whose only relationship to the man being interrogated is that he happens to have been born in the same country where that organization operates. For 11 hours. Not on his football career. Not on his refereeing credentials. On a terrorist organization. And when those 11 hours were finished, and whatever concerns the border agents had failed to be resolved by the 11th hour of questioning a man carrying a diplomatic passport and FIFA accreditation, he was not released to continue his journey. He was placed in a holding cell. Overnight. And then, without further explanation, without further hearing, without further opportunity to respond, he was walked to a gate and placed on a flight back to Istanbul. The border authorities' public statement, when the story broke, cited what it called vetting concerns. No specifics, no detail, no mention of what those vetting concerns actually consisted of after 11 hours of questioning that had failed to resolve them. Just vetting concerns. And that phrase, deployed with no supporting detail, was expected to end the conversation. The reasoning offered was that Somalia is one of 39 countries currently subject to enhanced travel restrictions imposed by the United States government. That is a factual statement. Is verifiable. Somalia is on the list. The list exists. And under the terms of that list, additional scrutiny at the border for citizens of those 39 countries is authorized. What the reasoning did not address, and what the border authorities' statement conspicuously avoided, was the specific set of documents Omar Artan was carrying at the moment of that additional scrutiny. A diplomatic passport, issued by a foreign government for the express purpose of official international travel, is not the same document as a standard tourist passport. A FIFA World Cup accreditation, issued by the tournament's governing body, is not the same document as a personal travel itinerary. A valid U.S. visa, cleared in advance through the exact channel the host country had set up for accredited tournament personnel, is not the same document as an on-arrival entry attempt. Every single one of those 3 documents represents a layer of prior vetting that had already been completed. And every single one of those layers was, in the space of 11 hours, treated by border agents in Miami as if it did not exist. FIFA's response at that point was institutional and careful. The governing body confirmed that Artan would not officiate at the tournament. It confirmed that it was not involved in host country immigration processes. It confirmed that the decision would not be changed. Those 3 sentences, delivered by press office. And then when the tournament opened the next day, and reporters put the situation directly to the man at the top of the organization, the man who had personally posed for photographs with the officiating delegation only weeks before, the answer he chose was 3 words long. The press conference was in Miami. The date was the 11th of June, 2026. The World Cup had opened the night before. The FIFA president was standing in front of the assembled international press corps for what was scheduled as a routine post-opening media availability. Broadcasters from every continent. Reporters from every major football covering publication. Microphones from television networks whose combined audience reaches into the billions. And in that room, a reporter stood up and asked him directly about the situation involving Omar Artan, the Somali referee, the CAF Referee of the Year, the FIFA selected official who had spent 11 hours in a corridor at the airport of that very city only days earlier and had been sent home before the tournament he was hired to work and had even kicked off. The president of FIFA was asked what his organization had done about it, what steps had been taken, what conversations had happened, what accountability, if any, was on the table. And he told the room to chill and relax. Chill and relax. That was the answer. Not, we are taking this very seriously. Not, we are in direct communication with the host authorities. Not, an official of ours was denied entry to our tournament, and we consider that a matter of the highest institutional concern. Not even a boilerplate line about respecting the sovereignty of the host country while regretting the outcome. Chill and relax. 3 words. Directed at the reporters. Directed at everyone watching. Directed by clear implication at Omar Artan himself, who was at that moment somewhere over the Atlantic on a flight the tournament had put him on, and would soon land in Mogadishu without the assignment his professional career had built toward. Now here is why that answer matters more than it might sound on first hearing. Governing bodies communicate in a language of their own. Every word is drafted. Every phrase is workshopped. Every public statement passes through a legal team, a communications team, and usually a personal advisor to the president himself before it leaves the room. When the head of an organization the size of FIFA speaks on camera at an event of this scale, they know that every syllable will be transcribed, translated, distributed, and analyzed within minutes of the words leaving their mouth. Nothing on that stage is accidental. Nothing on that stage is off the cuff. And when the answer to a direct question about the denial of entry of a World Cup official is chill and relax, that answer is not a slip. That answer is the position. That answer is what the organization has decided its posture should be. Which means that at some point, in the hours between Omar Artan boarding a plane back to Istanbul and the FIFA president stepping in front of that microphone, someone in that organization looked at the situation, weighed the options, and concluded that the most appropriate institutional response was to publicly dismiss anyone concerned about it. That is a choice. That is a documented choice. And that choice is the reason the phrase has since been quoted in the days since by every major football writer covering the tournament, by supporter organizations, by federation heads across 3 continents, and by former referees whose names carry weight in the international officiating community. If you have been following along with this analysis, and you are still with us, this is the point in the video to hit the like button. Not because we are asking for a favor, but because the algorithm punishes long-form coverage of subjects like this one unless it sees a signal that people are actually engaging with it. A quick tap on that like button is the single simplest thing anyone watching can do to make sure this kind of coverage reaches other football fans who deserve to hear the full story instead of a sanitized version most outlets are running. Thank you. Now back to what makes those 3 words so difficult to defend. Because in the 18 months leading up to the opening whistle of this tournament, the same president who delivered them had spent an enormous amount of media time promoting a very different message. The 2026 World Cup, in his own repeated public phrasing, was going to be the most inclusive tournament in the history of the sport. Everyone was welcome. That was the exact word he used. Welcome. Not tolerated. Not permitted with conditions. Welcome. The organization released promotional materials citing 500 million ticket requests from more than 200 countries, framing the tournament as a globalist celebration of the sport at a moment when the world needed one. Human rights commitments were referenced in press briefings. Anti-discrimination language was inserted into every official communication touching on the host country's immigration environment. And on the fields where the tournament was being sold to sponsors, to broadcasters, to national federations, to supporters, the pitch was consistent, unified, and clear. This would be the World Cup that proved football could bring the world together at a moment when very little else could. That was the promise. That was the word used in the promotional campaign. Welcome. And then, when the first documented test of that promise arrived in the form of a 34-year-old referee carrying a diplomatic passport and a FIFA accreditation, the response from a man who had spent a year and a half selling the promise was 3 words. Chill and relax. That is the gap. That is what the phrase actually represents. Not just a moment of poor communication. A gap between what the organization spent 18 months telling the world it was about and what it actually chose to do when the values it was selling were tested on the ground. Now, hold that image in your head. The president of FIFA, standing at a microphone in Miami, telling reporters to chill and relax. Hold it, because what happened next did not happen the following week. It did not happen after review process. It did not happen after a diplomatic exchange between governing bodies. It happened within hours. While Omar Artan was still in transit, before he had even landed in Mogadishu, before he had walked off the plane into the arms of a family that had been waiting 5 weeks to see him under very different circumstances, another statement was being finalized in a different office, in a different country, by a different governing body. And when that statement landed, it did not just answer the question of what football's institutions were going to do about the situation. It reframed the entire crisis. Aleksander Ceferin, the president of European football, released it through UEFA's official channels. And the wording was not casual. The wording was surgical. Every clause had been drafted. Every phrase had been chosen. And every sentence, read in the full context of what had happened the day before, carried the weight of a governing body that understood exactly what it was doing, exactly why it was doing it, and exactly what the words were going to communicate to the rest of the football world. This was not a note of sympathy. This was a public correction. And it was written in language so precise that veteran football correspondents began describing it, within hours of its release, as the most institutionally significant statement UEFA had issued in a generation. Let us go through it, because the statement itself is the story. The first sentence introduced Omar Artan as, in Ceferin's own words, an excellent young but already experienced referee who has proven himself at the highest competition level of the Confederation of African Football. Read that phrase carefully. Excellent. Young, already experienced, proven himself, at the highest competition level. Every single one of those words is a direct rebuke of the vetting concerns cited by the border authorities that had turned him away. This is not a man whose credentials are in question, the statement is saying. This is a man whose credentials are so well established that they can be laid out in a single opening line, without hedging, without qualification, without the diplomatic softening that governing bodies normally apply when speaking about someone else's officiating pool. This is European football saying, on the record, that African football's judgment about Omar Artan was correct. The second sentence continued. Football, Ceferin wrote, is made to connect people. On its own, that sentence would read as a familiar UEFA slogan, the kind of message the organization has printed on billboards for years. But placed in this specific context, 24 hours after a FIFA-selected referee had been denied entry to a FIFA tournament in a FIFA host country, and hours after the FIFA president had told reporters to chill and relax about it, the sentence functioned as something else. It functioned as a public assertion of what football was supposed to be, from the president of one governing body, addressed indirectly, but unmistakably to the president of another. Football is made to connect people, not to divide them, not to filter them at borders on the basis of country of birth, not to promise inclusion and then deliver rejection. Football is made to connect. The third sentence was the one that mattered most. UEFA, Ceferin wrote, wanted to show its respect to Omar and his outstanding officiating skills, which had earned him such a prestigious nomination. That last phrase, which had earned him such a prestigious nomination, is not a general reference to Artan's career. It is a specific, deliberate, and public reference to the FIFA World Cup selection that had been taken from him. UEFA was not simply offering a match. UEFA was making a statement in the most public and institutional way available to it that the nomination FIFA had made when it selected Omar Artan was correct, that the FIFA officiating committee's judgment had been sound, and that the border decision that had voided that judgment was, in the assessment of European football, not a football decision. It was a decision made outside of football by people who were not qualified to make football decisions, and it should not be allowed to stand as the final word on Omar Artan's professional achievement. And then, having said all of that in 3 carefully drafted sentences, UEFA announced what was actually going to do about it. On the 12th of August, 2026, exactly 2 months after Omar Artan boarded that plane back to Istanbul, he would walk onto the pitch at the Red Bull Arena in Salzburg, Austria, to officiate the UEFA Super Cup. The match between Paris Saint-Germain, the Champions League winners, and Aston Villa, the Europa League winners. One of the most prestigious single-match occasions in European football. The opening headline event of the European season. Watched by tens of millions of viewers. Broadcast in more than 100 territories. Scrutinized by every football writer on the continent. And on that night in Salzburg, Omar Artan would become the first referee from the African continent ever appointed to officiate a major UEFA final. Ever. In the entire history of European football. The historic first that was supposed to happen at the World Cup, taken from him at an airport in Miami, given back to him in Austria, by a governing body that has no jurisdiction over the World Cup, no obligation to compensate for what happened at that airport, and no reason to intervene, except the one Ceferin's own statement had made explicit. Football is made to connect people. And when the organization that runs the World Cup will not act on that principle, someone else will. Within hours of the UEFA announcement, a second statement landed. This one from Cairo. From the office of the President of the Confederation of African Football. Patrice Motsepe, the man who leads the governing body of the continent Omar Artan represents, released a message that carried its own institutional weight and its own carefully chosen phrasing. Artan, Motsepe wrote, had made Somalia and the entire people of the African continent extremely proud. His receipt of the CAF Referee of the Year award and his appointment to the World Cup were a recognition of his world-class ability and the international respect he enjoys. And then, in a passage that veteran football diplomats immediately flagged as unusual for the register of an interconfederation communication, the CAF president personally thanked his friend Aleksander Ceferin, by name, directly, warmly, for enabling Omar to officiate the Super Cup. Read what that gesture means. This is the president of one continental football body publicly, on the record, thanking the president of another continental football body for stepping in where a third governing body, the one that was actually supposed to act, did not. In the normal language of football diplomacy, a president of a confederation does not thank another confederation president by first name, publicly, unless something has just happened that is significant enough to warrant the departure from protocol. And in this case, it did. Because what Ceferin had just done from a country far outside the reach of African football's institutional map had communicated to Motsepe and to every federation head on his continent a simple, direct, unmistakable message. European football would treat Africa's best as European football's best. And that message, in the summer of 2026, in the middle of this tournament, was worth thanking the man by name for. While those two statements were being circulated across the international football press, something else was happening. In Mogadishu, at a football stadium not being used for a football match. Local reporting from the Somali capital, verified by international correspondents on the ground, described scene that has now been photographed, filmed, and archived. Thousands of people, not hundreds, thousands, arriving on foot, arriving in vehicles, arriving from neighborhoods across the city. Not for a game, not for a training session, for a man, for a referee, for Omar Artan, coming home from an airport in Miami without the tournament he had trained his entire adult life to work at. The stadium filled. Local officials spoke. Community leaders spoke. Children who had been told at school about the Somali referee who was going to work matches at the World Cup stood in the stands and applauded when he walked out onto the pitch. Because in that country, on that day, what had happened to Omar Artan was not a bureaucratic incident. It was national. It was continental. And the community response, coordinated in less than 72 hours by people who had never met him, said what the FIFA president had not said in 3 words on a Miami stage. That his professional achievement was real. That the country he represented was proud of him. And that the tournament he had been denied entry to would not be allowed to define what his career meant. Photographs of that gathering, of a stadium full of people standing to welcome home a referee, have since become some of the most widely shared images of this World Cup cycle. Not from any match, from a homecoming that was never supposed to happen. Around those 2 institutional statements and the images from Mogadishu, a broader wall of professional voices began to form. Veteran football writers from 3 continents publicly framed the UEFA appointment as, in the phrase repeated across coverage, one of the clearest institutional statements European football has made in a decade. Former international officials, men who had themselves worked at World Cups going back to the 1990s, told correspondents in on-the-record interviews that the border decision was, in their assessment, indefensible on any football criterion, and that the FIFA response fell short of what the governing body owed to any official on its own selected list. Supporter organizations in 5 European countries, several of which had been formally protesting other aspects of the tournament's management for weeks, cited the Artan case in follow-up statements as, in their words, the moment the pattern became impossible to ignore. 2 former African international referees, both of whom hold seats on regional officiating committees, went further, stating publicly that the case would be raised at the next scheduled meeting of the African Confederation's officiating body as a matter of institutional concern that required a formal response. What has emerged from all of that, in the days since the 11th of June, is not the opinion of one commentator or one federation or one former official. It is a professional consensus. A wall of voices from different countries, different institutions, and different levels of the sport, all pointing in the same direction. That the credentials were sound, that the vetting was excessive, that the response from Miami was inadequate, and that the response from Salzburg was the one that reflected what football, when it acts on its own values, is actually supposed to look like. And once you see that consensus laid out, one small phrase from earlier in this story starts to sound very different. Chill and relax. Chill and relax about a case where every serious voice in the professional football community has now said, on the record, that what happened was not acceptable. That is the position the FIFA president chose to defend. And in the coming blocks, we will show you why that position is now cracking on multiple fronts at once. Because here is what the coverage of the Artan case, in the hours and days after it broke, kept coming back to. He was not the first. He was not the second. He was, by the count of correspondents tracking this tournament since the group draw, at least the sixth documented incident involving accredited World Cup personnel or supporter groups being obstructed at the border of the host country in the 90 days leading up to the opening whistle. And once the pattern is laid out in sequence, the phrase chill and relax stops being an isolated gaffe from a Miami stage. It starts to look like the response of an organization that had already decided, well before June, that this category of incident was not something it was going to publicly own. Start with Iran. 10 days before the tournament opened, the Iranian Football Federation released a formal statement accusing FIFA of revoking its entire supporter ticket allocation. The full allocation. Not reduced. Not reissued. Revoked. Days before the team's first match. The Iranian Federation's public position was that the revocation had been communicated without warning, without appeal, and without any accompanying explanation that would allow the affected supporters to make alternative arrangements. FIFA, in its own subsequent communication on the matter, did not directly deny the revocation. It offered a general statement referencing security review protocols and left the specifics unaddressed. 14 Iranian officials, according to reporting confirmed by multiple international outlets, were separately denied entry visas to attend the team's matches at the tournament. 14. Not 1. Not 3. 14 accredited officials of a competing national federation, unable to be present at the tournament their team was playing in. And when the Iranian Federation raised the matter with the FIFA leadership, the response, per the Federation's own account given to reporters, was that immigration was a host country matter and outside FIFA's control. The same framing that would later be applied, word for word, to Omar Artan. Then came Embolo, a Swiss international, a player of significant club and national team stature. 10 days before the tournament opened, reports emerged that his United States travel authorization had been flagged under review. Not denied. Flagged. Under review. 10 days out from a tournament in which he was named to a national team squad that had been selected months in advance, whose travel logistics had been coordinated with the host country's tournament liaison office for weeks, and whose accreditation had been processed through the standard channels. The review, according to reporting at the time, was resolved before the tournament began, and Embolo did travel. But the incident itself, coming as it did in the same window as the Artan case and the Iranian Federation situation, added a new dimension to the pattern. A named player from a European national team with a public profile was, at least momentarily, subject to the same category of administrative obstruction that had turned away the CAF Referee of the Year at Miami International Airport. And what the Embolo case demonstrated in its own quiet way was that the pattern was not confined to officials or supporters or personnel from any single region. It was broader than that, and it was reaching, at least in one instance, into the actual playing rosters of participating nations. That should have prompted, in any reasonable reading of what a global tournament governing body owes to its participants, a formal institutional review. What it prompted was silence. Then came the 2 Iraqi incidents. A striker for the Iraqi national team, arriving at his port of entry, was held for what the Iraqi Football Federation subsequently reported as 7 hours of phone inspection. Not questioning. Phone inspection. Border agents going through the contents of his personal device for 7 hours. And a team photographer, part of the Iraqi accredited delegation traveling with the national team specifically to document their tournament, was denied entry and sent home. Not questioned and released. Denied entry. Sent home. A photographer, whose entire professional purpose at that airport was to arrive with the team he had traveled with and photograph them at the tournament they were competing in. And the response from FIFA to that specific incident, again per subsequent reporting, was the same framing that had been applied to Iran and would later be applied to Artan. Immigration is a host country matter, outside FIFA's direct control. No further comment. And when you lay out those 4 cases in sequence, Iran's ticket allocation, Iran's 14 officials, Embolo's flag review, Iraq's striker and photographer, and then 10 days later, Omar Artan at Miami, what you have is not a series of unrelated incidents. What you have is a pattern. What you have is a category. Accredited personnel, supporter groups, and even named players from specific parts of the world being subjected to a level of border obstruction that no comparable tournament in the modern era has produced at anything approaching this frequency. And what you have is a governing body that has, in each successive case, chosen the same institutional response. That it is not its problem. That immigration is a host country matter. And when pressed in front of cameras, that the people asking should chill and relax. That is the pattern Ceferin's statement was actually responding to. Not just to what happened to one Somali referee, but to a pattern of institutional silence that had already been unfolding for weeks. And in the next block, we are going to walk you through what that silence has done to the trust the rest of world football has in FIFA right now. Because it is worse than most casual viewers realize. And it is not going away. Because if this were only about the summer of 2026, if this were only about one referee, one striker, one photographer, and one set of denied ticket allocations at one specific tournament, the response from the football world would be different. It would be measured. It would be procedural. There would be a review, a report, a set of recommendations, and the sport would move on. But the reason the Artan case has landed with the force it has, the reason UEFA's statement was drafted in language that's specific, the reason CAF's president thanks Ceferin by first name in a public communication, the reason supporter organizations across 5 European countries are now citing the case in their own formal filings, is that the pattern under this incident is not new. It is old. It stretches back through the previous World Cup cycle, through the one before that, and into the institutional memory of everyone in world football who has been paying attention for longer than the last 4 years. When Qatar hosted the 2022 World Cup, the tournament was preceded by more than a decade of documented concerns raised by international labor organizations, human rights bodies, and independent journalists about the conditions of the migrant workers building the stadiums, the transportation infrastructure, and the hospitality apparatus of the host country. FIFA's public response throughout that period was framed in language that has become familiar to anyone tracking the governing body's communication patterns. Labor policy was a host country matter. Human rights was a matter for the relevant national authorities. FIFA's role was to organize the sporting competition, not to intervene in the domestic policy environment of its host. That framing, repeated over years, established a template. The template was that when concerns arose about the treatment of individuals in and around a FIFA tournament by the host country's own institutions, FIFA's default posture was to defer. Not to challenge, not to publicly advocate, not to demand that its own selected personnel be protected as a condition of the tournament proceeding. To defer, and to hope that the tournament itself would produce enough goodwill, in the form of goals, moments, and highlights, to render the underlying concerns background noise by the time the final was played. Then came the 2015 corruption crisis. The morning of the 27th of May, 2015, when senior FIFA officials were arrested in a Zurich hotel by Swiss authorities acting on a United States indictment, and when the entire governance structure of world football was, for the first time in the modern era, publicly framed as a matter of federal criminal concern by a member state's own justice system. The resignation of Sepp Blatter followed. A reform commission was announced. A new president was elected. The organization spent the following years rebuilding its public image around the language of transparency, integrity, and reform. And in the run-up to the 2026 World Cup, that language was the foundation of the tournament's public sales pitch. This would be the World Cup that proved the reforms had worked. That the new FIFA was different from the old FIFA. That the governance of world football, whatever its imperfections, was now oriented around the values it had spent nearly a decade promising to embody. If you are following this analysis, and you want to see how this story continues to develop across the remaining weeks of the tournament, this is the moment to hit that subscribe button. Because we are only in the second week of a 5-week competition, and the pattern we are walking you through is not going to end with Omar Artan. There will be more denials of entry. There will be more federation-level protests. There will be more legal filings. And we are going to cover every single one of them as they happen in the same level of documented detail you are getting right now. Subscribing takes 1 second, it costs nothing, and it is the single most direct way to make sure this coverage keeps reaching your feed as the tournament unfolds. Thank you for being here. Now back to the trust deficit. Because what makes the summer of 2026 different from any previous chapter in FIFA's governance history is that the reform narrative, the one that was supposed to render the old patterns obsolete, has now itself been subjected to its first meaningful public test. And it has failed the test not in the abstract but on the ground, in specific documented cases with specific named individuals. The Qatar template of deferring to the host country on matters of individual treatment has not been abandoned. It has been reinforced. The 2015 reform narrative of a new FIFA committed to transparency and accountability has been reduced, in most visible test case available, to 3 words delivered on a Miami stage: chill and relax. And the reason UEFA's statement carried the weight that it did, the reason it has been quoted more than any single institutional communication of this tournament so far, is that it was drafted by people who understood what the historical stakes actually were. They understood that they were not just responding to Omar Artan's case. They were responding to the entire post-Zurich reform narrative that FIFA had built over the last decade, and they were saying, in the plainest institutional language available, that the narrative had not delivered. Not on this. Not on Iran. Not on Iraq. Not on Embolo. Not on the 14 officials denied visas. And now, most visibly, not on the CAF Referee of the Year. That is the deeper reason this specific case matters. It is not just about one man at one airport. It is about whether the promises made in the aftermath of the deepest institutional crisis in FIFA's modern history have been kept. And on the evidence available in June of 2026, that question has an answer that the leadership of world football is going to have to reckon with, whether it wants to or not. Because here is what the Artan case did not create. What it accelerated. The institutional response you have been watching from Europe over the last week did not begin on the 11th of June. It has been building for months. And once you understand the sequence of what was already in motion when Omar Artan boarded that plane at Miami International Airport, the speed of UEFA's statement stops looking like an emotional reflex and starts looking like what it actually was. The public surfacing of a position that had been forming inside the corridors of European football administration for the better part of a year. Start with the supporter organizations. In the 6 months leading up to the tournament, formal legal complaints have been filed by supporter associations in multiple European member states, accusing FIFA of monopoly abuse in its ticketing practices. Not general complaints. Formal complaints, filed through the appropriate legal and regulatory channels of the countries in question. Naming FIFA specifically. Detailing specific pricing structures, resale platform arrangements, and allocation policies that the complainants argue constitute a deliberate concentration of ticket distribution rights in ways that disadvantage the traveling supporters who form the actual on-the-ground audience of the tournament. And what those complaints represent taken together is the first time in the modern history of the World Cup that FIFA's commercial architecture around the tournament has been challenged in the actual legal apparatus of European states by the very supporter communities the tournament claims to serve. That is not a talking point. That is a case number. In more than one European jurisdiction. And it was already sitting on the desks of European regulators when Omar Artan landed in Miami. Then there was the FIFA Council walkout. Earlier this year, at a scheduled meeting of the FIFA Council, the highest permanent governing body of world football outside of Congress itself, 8 delegates from UEFA member federations walked out. 8. Not one delegate expressing individual displeasure. Not 2 making a point. 8. In a coordinated departure. From a meeting where the agenda, per reporting at the time, touched on matters including tournament governance, commercial arrangements, and the treatment of member federation concerns during the run-up to the 2026 competition. The walkout itself was not accompanied by a formal public statement. It did not need to be. In the language of international football administration, 8 coordinated departures from a council meeting is itself the statement. It communicates to every other federation head watching that the European bloc, or at least a significant portion of it, has reached a point where the standard mechanisms of internal disagreement are no longer sufficient. And when a body like the FIFA Council loses that many voices from its most influential single confederation in a single session, the message is unmistakable. Whatever consensus was supposed to hold on the direction of the organization is no longer holding. Add to that the boycott discussions. And this is where the pattern reaches its most institutionally serious form. Reporting confirmed by multiple international outlets in the months before the tournament described active conversations across approximately 20 federation heads about the shape and posture of Europe's engagement with FIFA leadership during the World Cup cycle. Not conversations about withdrawing from the tournament itself. That threshold has not been crossed and is not being discussed at the level of any credible sourcing. But conversations about coordinated responses to specific decisions. About collective statements on specific incidents. About the terms on which European federations would engage with FIFA's public messaging around the tournament. 20 federation heads. Actively coordinating. On the question of how European football, as a bloc, would relate to the governing body of world football during its most visible commercial period. And that is the environment into which the Artan case landed. That is the context in which the UEFA statement was drafted. That is the reason it was drafted in language that specific, that fast, and that public. Because Ceferin's office was not responding in isolation. It was responding as the visible institutional face of a European football administration that had already spent months coordinating on exactly the question that the Artan case was going to force into the open. What is the appropriate response from a confederation that generates more of world football's commercial value than any other to a governing body that has repeatedly, over the last 12 months, communicated that European priorities, European supporter concerns, European federation objections, are secondary to a set of institutional preferences that the European bloc no longer accepts as valid? The Artan case gave that pre-existing coordination its clearest public expression. It gave UEFA a specific individual with unimpeachable professional credentials whose treatment could be publicly rebuked without any political ambiguity, without any factional overtone, and without any risk of being framed as an internal European power play. It gave European football, in other words, exactly the moment it needed to say what it had been preparing to say for months. That the coordination was real. That the concerns were serious. That the walkout was not an isolated event. That the legal complaints were not going away. And that the response of world football's premier confederation, when the values of the sport were tested by a specific documented case, would be visible, immediate, and impossible to misread. And once you see that, everything about the speed of what happened after the 11th of June begins to make sense. It was not a reaction. It was a release. Now, in the interest of covering this story honestly, and not turning what is already a serious institutional case into an exercise in one-sided outrage, it is worth pausing here to say something the coverage of this incident has largely avoided. FIFA's core defense in this situation is not without merit. And a viewer who is following this story carefully deserves to hear it laid out at its strongest, in exact form its defenders inside the football world are making it. Because if you strip away the three words that dominated the news cycle and look at the actual institutional position FIFA is taking on the underlying case, that position is grounded in a set of legal and diplomatic realities that any governing body in FIFA's structural position would have to reckon with. And ignoring those realities does not make them go away. It only makes the analysis of what happened weaker. So let us go through the strongest version of the FIFA case in full before returning to why, even taken at its strongest, the response has still not been adequate to the moment. Start with the sovereignty argument. Immigration decisions at every functioning national border in the world are the exclusive jurisdiction of the sovereign government of the receiving country. That is not a footnote in international law. That is a foundational principle of how the international system is organized. A private international sporting body, however large, however commercially significant, however globally recognized, does not have the standing to override, to publicly rebuke, or even to formally contest a border decision made by the domestic security apparatus of a sovereign state. If FIFA had, on the morning of the 11th of June, publicly demanded that the United States government reverse a specific individual border decision, the diplomatic response would have been immediate, and it would not have been favorable to FIFA. It would have set a precedent that no future host nation of any FIFA tournament could reasonably accept. And it would have exposed the organization to a category of institutional criticism from other prospective host countries that would make future bidding cycles substantially more complicated. That is a real constraint. That is not manufactured. Add to that the specific legal framing of the enhanced vetting list. Somalia is, at the time of this tournament, one of 39 countries subject to formal enhanced travel restrictions imposed by United States federal authorities. That designation is not something FIFA chose. It is not something FIFA endorsed. It is a matter of domestic security policy determined by the government of the host country through its own statutory and regulatory processes. And under the terms of that designation, additional scrutiny at the border for individuals holding citizenship of those countries is authorized. FIFA's public statement that it was not involved in host country immigration processes was, from a strict legal reading, entirely accurate. It was not lying. It was not evading. It was describing an actual limitation on its institutional authority. And a governing body that overreached in public against that limitation, even in a case as sympathetic as Artan's, would be establishing an operational posture that would be extremely difficult to sustain across future tournament cycles. There is also the pattern argument which the defenders of FIFA's response inside the football community have made most persistently. Every World Cup in modern history has produced some category of visa dispute, entry denial, or accredited personnel obstruction at the borders of the host country. Russia 2018 had them. Qatar 2022 had them. Prior tournaments going back decades had them. And in most of those previous cycles, FIFA's response was the same one it has taken now. Defer to host country authority. Handle the individual case through quiet diplomatic channels. Avoid public confrontation. Move the tournament forward. That posture is not new. And in most previous cycles, it did not generate the level of criticism it is now receiving. Which means defenders argue that a significant portion of the current outrage is being amplified by the specific political moment, not by anything genuinely unprecedented in FIFA's institutional behavior. The chill and relax phrase itself, defenders inside the football world will point out, is being read in isolation from the setting in which it was said. It was delivered in an off-the-cuff exchange, not in a prepared statement, and its dismissive tone was directed, per the defender's reading, at the media framing of the case rather than at Artan himself or at the underlying substance. A charitable reading would suggest that the FIFA president was pushing back against what he perceived as a media storm around a case whose specific facts, in his assessment, were being sensationalized. Whether or not you accept that reading, it is a reading that exists, that has been articulated by people whose football credentials are serious, and that deserves to be represented honestly in any analysis of the situation. Add finally the operational constraint. FIFA is running a tournament that will span 5 weeks, multiple host cities, 3 participating countries, and thousands of accredited personnel across officiating, media, security, medical, and delegation categories. A governing body whose entire posture became publicly confrontational toward the primary, host country's border authorities in the first week of the competition would face immediate consequences for the rest of the tournament. Access, cooperation, logistical support. Every one of those channels of coordination with the host country's institutional apparatus would become harder overnight. And that is not an abstract concern. That is the operational environment inside which every decision about how to respond publicly is being made. So yes, if you accept those 4 pieces, the sovereignty argument, the statutory framing, the pattern of past cycles, and the operational constraint, then FIFA's core institutional defense is more coherent than the summary version of it. That is the honest version of the case for what the organization did. And you deserve to hear it before we return, in the next block, to why, even taken at its strongest, it is still not enough. But here is where those arguments, all of which are legitimate, all of which deserve to be represented in any honest coverage of this case, still do not carry the FIFA response over the finish line. Because none of them explain what actually went wrong. And once you see the specific gap between what those arguments cover and what the actual FIFA behavior looked like, the defense stops functioning as a defense. It starts functioning as a description of the institutional space that was available for something better and was not used. Start with sovereignty. Yes, FIFA cannot override a United States border decision. Nobody serious is arguing that it should have. Nobody is claiming the organization had the legal standing to demand that Omar Artan be readmitted, that his flight home be reversed, or that the Miami Border Authority be publicly overruled by a private international sporting body. That is not the standard against which the FIFA response is failing. The standard against which it is failing is much lower than that. It is the standard of whether the organization within the entirely legal, entirely diplomatic, entirely appropriate envelope of what a governing body is allowed to say, chose to publicly stand behind its own selected official. Ceferin managed it. He did in 3 sentences. He affirmed Artan's credentials, he affirmed his professional standing, and he offered a concrete demonstration of European football's respect for the man in the form of a Super Cup appointment. Not one word of Ceferin's statement violated sovereignty. Not one clause challenged the legal authority of the United States government to make its own border decisions. Every phrase operated entirely within the envelope of legitimate institutional communication, which means the envelope was there. The envelope was legally available. The envelope was diplomatically appropriate. And FIFA, standing in front of the same envelope, chose to fill it with 3 different words. Chill and relax. That is not a sovereignty problem. That is a choice made inside the space where sovereignty is not at issue. Same with the statutory framing. Yes, Somalia is on the enhanced vetting list. Yes, FIFA had no formal authority to alter that list. But the presence of a country on a vetting list is a legal fact, is not an institutional endorsement. FIFA could have, with complete accuracy and complete deference to United States law, said this, that the border authority's assessment was a matter for the United States government, that the FIFA officiating committee's judgment on Omar Artan's credentials remained unchanged, that the organization regretted that a member of its selected officiating pool would not be able to participate, and that it stood by its selection process and its confidence in the referee whose name it had placed on that list. Every one of those statements would have been legally uncontroversial. Every one would have been diplomatically appropriate. Every one would have honored the sovereignty of the host country while also honoring the integrity of the organization's own decision-making process. FIFA said none of them. Instead, the president of the organization, on camera, at his own tournament, said chill and relax. And here is why that phrase, in particular, cannot be rescued by the defender's argument that it was off the cuff. Off the cuff is not a defense. Off the cuff is a diagnosis. Because in the language of institutional communication, prepared statements are drafted to protect the organization from what the leadership actually believes. Off-the-cuff phrases are what the leadership actually believes, spoken in the moment before the communications team can intervene. When a prepared FIFA statement says, immigration is a host country matter, that is a defensive posture. When the FIFA president, unscripted, in front of cameras, says chill and relax, that is not a defensive posture. That is a reveal. Is the underlying attitude of the organization allowed to surface before the diplomatic apparatus has time to package it? And that attitude, once it has been publicly seen, cannot be unseen. It has been transcribed. It has been quoted. It has been referenced by federation heads, supporter organizations, and former officials on 3 continents. Is now part of the permanent record of how this organization related to its own selected personnel at its own tournament. Which brings us to the trust question, the one that sits underneath all of this. FIFA has spent the last decade rebuilding institutional trust in the aftermath of a governance crisis so severe that senior officials were arrested in a Zurich hotel by federal authorities. The organization asked the football world to accept, on the basis of a set of reforms and a set of promises, that the new FIFA was different from the old FIFA, that the values it now promoted were not just marketing language, that the inclusive World Cup it was selling was not just a slogan. Football fans, national federations, referee associations, and confederations across the world extended that presumption of good faith. They gave the organization the benefit of the doubt. They agreed, tentatively, to treat the reforms as real. And in exchange, the reformed organization was expected to produce, at the first serious public test, evidence that the reforms had actually changed institutional behavior. That when a specific documented case arose in which the values were on the line, the organization would respond in a way that reflected the values it had spent a decade selling. The Artan case was that test. It was not a hard test. The envelope of what was legally, diplomatically, and institutionally available was wide open. The words needed were 3 sentences long, and the response was 3 different words that no reformed FIFA could plausibly have chosen. That is why the benefit of the doubt is gone. Not because sovereignty was violated. It was not. Not because the law was misread. It was read correctly. But because the choice inside the legal envelope was the wrong choice. And it was the wrong choice at the exact moment when the reformed organization needed the choice to be right. That is the actual failure. And is not a failure that can be walked back with a follow-up statement. It is a failure that will be quoted for years. Zoom out for a moment. Step back from the specifics of the Artan case. Step back from the individual sentences of the FIFA press conference and the UEFA statement. And look at what has actually shifted in the summer of 2026 in the institutional geography of world football. Because something has moved. Not in an official document. Not in a formal restructuring of confederation authority. Not in any published resolution that could be pointed to as the marker of the change. But in something older and more powerful than any of those things. In the direction that the football world instinctively looks when a moment of moral or institutional testing arrives to see what the sport itself is going to say. For most of the last century, that direction was FIFA. When a scandal broke, when a governance question surfaced, when the sport needed to publicly articulate what it stood for, the world turned to Zurich. Whatever criticism you could level at the organization, whatever governance failures you could catalog, the fact of that instinctive orientation was not seriously in dispute. FIFA was the address to which the questions were sent. And in the summer of 2026, for the first time in the modern era of the sport, on a specific documented case with a specific individual and a specific set of institutional choices, the questions were not sent to Zurich. They were sent to Nyon, the headquarters of European football. And Nyon answered them. Cairo answered them. Salzburg answered them. And the answer that came back was different in substance, different in tone, and different in institutional register from anything Zurich produced. That is a shift. That is a real shift. And whether or not it lasts beyond this specific case, whether or not it becomes structural or remains circumstantial, the fact that it happened at all is a datum that historians of the sport will not be able to ignore when they write the story of this decade. Consider what this means for the tournaments that are coming. The 2027 Women's World Cup, already awarded, already scheduled, already deep in the planning cycle. The 2030 Men's World Cup, a tricontinental arrangement whose commercial and diplomatic architecture depends on the presumption that FIFA's institutional posture is credible enough to hold the pieces together. The 2031 Women's World Cup, still in a bidding phase where the questions of governance, human rights, and treatment of tournament personnel are already being asked more sharply than they were 4 years ago. Every one of those tournaments is now going to be planned in an environment where the confederations that participate in them have a working memory of what happened in June of 2026, where the federation heads and confederation presidents who make decisions about cooperation, about credentialing, about supporter arrangements, about broadcast partnerships, have seen with their own eyes what the FIFA institutional response looks like under stress and what the alternative looks like, and they will act on that memory. Not always publicly, not always through formal channels, but in the accumulated thousand small decisions that determine how a tournament is actually run at the operational level, the memory of Miami Airport and the memory of Salzburg will both be present. And the choices made in the light of both memories will not be identical to the choices that would have been made if only Miami had happened. That is what a real institutional shift looks like. It does not require a press release. It reshapes the environment inside which future decisions are made. And once the environment has been reshaped, the shift becomes self-reinforcing. Every future case that echoes the Artan pattern will now be evaluated against the Salzburg standard. Every future FIFA response to a similar situation will be compared, in the mind of every federation president watching, to what UEFA showed was possible in June of 2026. That comparison is not going away, and FIFA cannot outrun it. Which brings us to the specific claim that this tournament will be remembered more for what happened at Miami Airport than for what happens in the final. That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is a considered observation about how the sport actually remembers its own history. Every World Cup produces a champion. Every World Cup produces a set of moments. Goals, saves, celebrations, controversies, the ones that get compiled into highlight reels and played back on anniversary years for as long as the sport continues to be organized. Those moments are real, and they matter, and the eventual winner of this tournament will earn the trophy on their own merits and be remembered accordingly. But underneath the highlight reel, in the layer of memory that shapes how the institutions of a sport actually behave in the decades that follow a tournament, there is another kind of moment. It is the moment that reveals what the sport is really about at the level of its governance. And that moment for the 2026 World Cup is not going to be a goal in a knockout round. It is going to be an 11-hour interrogation in an airport corridor. It is going to be a stadium in Mogadishu filling with thousands of people to welcome home a referee. It is going to be 3 words on a Miami stage. And it is going to be a statement from Salzburg that filled the vacuum those 3 words created. The champion of this World Cup will be remembered by fans of the winning nation for a generation. That is how football memory works. But the institutional memory of this tournament, the one that will shape how the sport governs itself for the next decade, is already being written. And is being written by what happened at that airport and what happened in response to it. That is the story that outlasts the trophy. And is the story we now have to decide as football fans, as viewers, as people who care about what this sport actually stands for, how we are going to talk about in the years ahead. So return at the end of all of this to the question that opened the video. Is FIFA still the moral center of world football? We have walked through the sequence together. We have looked at what happened to Omar Artan at Miami International Airport. We have looked at what the president of FIFA said when asked about it. We have looked at what the president of UEFA said in the same news cycle when the space of institutional response was still open. We have walked through the pattern of adjacent incidents. Iran, Embolo, Iraq. We have walked through the accumulated context of legal complaints, of coordinated walkouts, of federation-level coordination that had already been building for months. We have laid out the strongest version of FIFA's own defense, and we have laid out why, taken at its strongest, that defense still does not carry the moment over the line. And we have looked at what all of that means for the institutional geography of the sport going forward. And now, at the end of the sequence, the question comes back. Not for us to answer. For you. Because the honest answer is that the institutional shift underway in football, right now, is not the kind of thing that gets settled by any single writer, any single broadcast, or any single video. It gets settled in the accumulated response of the football-watching public. In what fans, federations, supporter organizations, and future host countries choose to remember, choose to demand, and choose to reward. That is the actual mechanism through which the direction of the sport gets set. And it is only working properly when the people whose attention it is being organized for are engaged in the conversation. Which is where you come in. Omar Artan, meanwhile, has a specific date on his calendar now. The 12th of August, 2026. The Red Bull Arena in Salzburg, Austria. Paris Saint-Germain against Aston Villa. The UEFA Super Cup. The opening night of the European club football season. And when he walks out onto that pitch to conduct the pre-match protocols, he will do so as the first referee from the African continent ever appointed to officiate a major UEFA final. Ever. In the entire recorded history of European football. A historic first that was supposed to happen at a World Cup in the United States, taken from him by an 11-hour interrogation at an airport, given back to him by a phone call from Salzburg, delivered on a stage that no governing body of world football, however careful or however powerful, will now be able to prevent from mattering. And when you watch that match on the 12th of August, when the coverage cuts to the referee walking out of the tunnel, when his name appears on the broadcast graphics and the commentators note the historic first that this moment represents, the story you have just heard will be the reason you understand what you are watching. That is not incidental. That is the actual meaning of what has been built in institutional response over the last several weeks, and is worth carrying with you into whatever the rest of this World Cup produces on the pitch. Because the pitch will produce goals and champions and the ordinary drama of a global tournament. But the institutional layer underneath the pitch has already produced something else. It has produced a moment that historians of the sport will still be discussing when the trophy raised in July has been in a display case for a decade. If this analysis brought clarity to a story that most of your feed is covering in pieces, if the sequence we walked through in the last 40 minutes help you see what is actually happening under the surface of this tournament, then here is the ask, and it is direct. Hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of long-form football coverage deserves to reach more of the fans who are looking for it. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already. There are more of these coming across the rest of the tournament, and every one of them will be reported with the same standard of documented sourcing you got today. And ring the bell, so the next one lands in your notifications the moment it goes up, not 3 days later when the moment has already moved on. Then leave a comment. Not a general reaction. A specific one. Tell me this. First, do you believe UEFA's response was genuine institutional conviction, or was it a well-timed opportunity for European football to seize the moral high ground it has been maneuvering toward for months? Second, do you personally still trust the reformed FIFA to protect the values it promotes, or has the summer of 2026 permanently ended that trust for you? Third, and this is the one I most want to see the answers on, in your view, who now speaks for world football when the sport is tested? FIFA, UEFA, CAF, the supporter organization, someone else entirely? Drop it in the comments. Be specific. Be direct. And I will read every single answer, because how this conversation continues from here matters more than any single closing line I could give it. Football at this scale is never only a tournament. It is a moment in time. And the moment we are living through right now, between an airport in Miami and a stadium in Salzburg, is one of the ones the sport is going to be talking about long after every result of this World Cup has been forgotten. Thanks for staying to the end. See you in the next one.